Welcome back to a series look. Now, the more observant among you might have noticed that I've got a haircut and a bit of a shave since the last time I was on camera, but what can I say, after the last series look, I got in contact with a really good barber.
Yes. Oh, yes. We're seeing some skin now.
If you saw the last video, we looked at the first three Child's Play films, which were undoubtedly horror films. And by the end it really felt like, at least to me, that they'd done everything they could in the horror genre. In fact, series creator Don Mancini himself had said after Child's Play 3 it felt like he ran out of ideas, which meant that the next two entries would be more comedic. But to explain his rationale for going for a more comedic meta approach, I think we need to go back to the 90s.
Alrighty. We were on the break!
The 90s horror landscape started off a little bit rough. The excess of the 1980s in the slasher genre was starting to fade away. This meant that horror icons like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers all saw their films fail coming into the new decade. Audiences were going for something a bit more realistic and psychological, which saw films like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and, of course, Hannibal Lecter. Ironically, one of these slasher genres would plant the seed for what would inform the rest of 90s horror. You see, in 1994, Wes Craven will return to his creation of Freddy Krueger and give us Wes Craven's New Nightmare. New Nightmare took the fictional villain of Freddy Krueger and had him attack the real-life actors from the series.
In a town where movies go over schedule and directors go over budget, something far more evil is out of control.
I think that only happens in the movies.
What happens when the story dies? The evil is set free. That's what I'm writing.
This is still a script we're talking about, right, Wes?
It was still very much a horror film, but the meta-narrative and self-awareness gave new life to the series. Unfortunately for some people, the supernatural aspects clashed with the realism and it took people out of the narrative, but it was an important step towards what would follow. 2 years later, Craven would try this with much more success with a new series that would inform much of the horror landscape for the rest of the decade, if not more, with Scream. Scream took a much greater leap into comedy than New Nightmare. In fact, it was almost an outright parody of the slasher genre and celebration of horror in general, but it really embraced those cliches for comedy.
Someone is playing a deadly game. Someone who's seen one too many scary movies.
Like scary movies.
What's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a scary movie.
It was massively successful. Many films and many series came about afterwards to try to capitalise on the success of this new meta horror comedy. See, if we look at the 90s like an ice cream cone, you know, the cone is fine, but it doesn't really work without the ice screams. Okay, there's no analogy here. It's a really hot room. I'm wearing it. A coat in summer. I just needed an ice cream because it's fucking hot. Don Mancini, inspired by Scream, saw a fresh opportunity to reinvent Chucky as a comedy series. And to do that, we moved on from Andy Barclay and on to Chucky's love life. And if you still don't think Chucky was inspired by Scream, let's get a poster here for Scream 2 and a poster here for Bride of Chucky. Thank you very much. Transition.
Of course, this new era of horror led to Bride of Chucky. Now, when I was growing up, I was more aware of the comedic entries of the Chucky series than the horror ones. After all, the horror ones actually predated me. And at the time, they seemed stupid and crass, but I didn't have the appreciation for horror or parody then that I do now. My interest in the series was starting to wane after Child's Play 3, and thankfully in Bride of Chucky they shake things up a bit by doing something new. A comedy.
Classic. Never goes out of style.
That was good.
From the very beginning, the movie knows what it's going to be. It's a bit cheesier and more comedic. And in the opening, it actually looks like something straight out of a satire horror. The lightning, the shadows, and the sets. It's all very tongue-in-cheek and cliche. It has no problem breaking the fourth wall either. Like, check out these horror props in the beginning. I actually think the film has a sort of look and a polish that feels a little bit ahead of its time. I don't know how to explain it, just doesn't feel like it's stuck in the 90s like some other horror films from that era. Well, except for maybe the soundtrack. So our story is that a former flame of Charles E. Ray, Tiffany Valentine, frees him hoping to marry him. But Chucky is such an asshole that even as a doll he won't do it.
Me to marry you?
What are you, fucking nuts?
She sees this and locks him up, but he breaks free and turns her into a doll too. Of course, in her death scene, Tiffany is watching The Bride of Frankenstein. The illusions and the impact of that film goes far beyond the title. Of course, Tiffany very much feels like the bride, and that when the bride comes to life, she is horrified at the sight of her supposed mate. And for the bride, that's Frankenstein, but for Tiffany, her supposed mate is Chucky, and she's somewhat horrified at who he is.
I've been a prisoner of my love for you for a very long time. Now it's payback time. Sweet dreams, asshole.
We also have the allusion to Frankenstein when Chucky is brought back to life, and that he has to be stitched back together, which gives him his new design for the next 2 films. And this might be sacrilege, because some people love the original 3 films design, and that's a kind of a childish doll, and it's sleek and scary. But to me, this is the iconic Chucky design. He's gnarled and grisly. It's kind of violent and gory, but at the same time somewhat campy. And it really works, and it really suits Brad Dourif's voice to look a bit more grizzled.
We're dolls, you dope! Shut up!
You shut up.
Chucky's plan is to get an amulet buried with Charles E. Ray and transfer both their bodies into Tiffany's neighbour and his girlfriend. Aw, look, it's Katherine Heigl before she had an ego. Well, what she doesn't have an ego, she makes up for with an uncle dad cop played by John Ritter.
Why does that look so familiar?
This type of movie in the 90s was pretty tricky because some movies just tried to be Scream and others tried to be funny and failed. But this movie succeeds. It does have something in common with Scream though, in that it's aware of other horror films.
That looks so familiar.
You know, I just sort of love this movie, and it manages to do something that a lot of the self-aware horror comedies didn't really manage to do well, and that is it provides laughs while also expanding upon the lore. I also have to give major props to Jennifer Tilly as a sinister, sexy and scene-stealing Tiffany Valentine. She is one of the best additions to this franchise, and maybe any horror franchise I can think of. She's clearly having so much fun with the role, and she has no problem poking fun at everything, including herself.
Barbie, eat your heart out.
Having a female co-lead like Tiffany also allows us to see a different dynamic for Chucky. See a bit more of a softer side.
Tiff! I'm sorry. For everything.
But he still has some great lines too.
Have you got a rubber?
Have I got a rubber?
Yeah.
Tiff!
What?
Look at me! I'm all rubber.
Rude fucking doll.
So how did you end up like this?
Well, it's a long story. In fact, if it was a movie, it would take 3 or 4 sequels just to do it justice.
Stabbings went out with Bundy and Dahmer. You look like Martha Stewart with that thing.
Who the fuck is Martha Stewart?
Some criminal.
What do we do with him?
I don't know. What would Martha Stewart do?
Even though the movie is more comedic, it still has some pretty great kills too. Like, check out these ones.
No!
Wait. Are we just going to blow past the puppet sex?
We're dolls, you dope!
Sorry, Chucky.
I don't know what else I can say. The killer pair of dolls is just a lot of fun. It's an amazing horror comedy that I feel like I could easily throw into rotation with other greats in the genre. If there were some knocks against it, the human leads have their purpose and they're as developed as they need to be, but they just aren't that interesting. In fact, I think the film in general gets a bit less interesting towards the end of the movie. It just becomes a bit formulaic. The ending also promises to keep things fresh with the birth of a child.
Bride of Chucky might be one of, if not my favourite entry in the whole series. It's a fantastic horror comedy that doesn't sacrifice on the base the previous films built. In fact, it builds on it itself. It allows us to see a new side to the character and put him in new and interesting situations. It still has moments of violence and horror, but it also has great moments of comedy. In fact, it feels like an entry you could just throw on independent of the other films, if you had never seen them before. And it's one I'd be very happy to throw on around Halloween time. Could I say the same thing for the sequel? Seed of Chucky. God, I'm glad this is in 3D. Serial killer sperm is where I draw the line.
Well, if I said Bride of Chucky was like Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Seed of Chucky is even more so. Right down to the fact they're making a movie about our horror icon. It takes a real meta approach. Jennifer Tilly plays herself, Redman plays himself, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. It begins with us seeing the offspring from the last film, who, by the way, is doing the worst act ever.
Fucker! Try to rip me throat out.
I was trying to give you a hug.
Oh, these jokes are worse than mine. Who wrote that?
The child going by Glenn sees they're making a movie about Chucky and Tiffany, based on the previous film, and realises that he's their son. Oh, and apparently Chucky is made in Japan. That's never come up before. Which brings Glenn to Hollywood, where he revives the dolls.
Ade Due Dambala awake.
While Tiffany immediately feels a sense of parental responsibility, Chucky, not so much. She decides to quit murdering, but Chucky, while promising to do that, doesn't. They both get somewhat infatuated with Jennifer Tilly, who's acting in the fake movie. Yep, Jennifer Tilly falls in love with Jennifer Tilly.
Can you really blame her?
Tiffany wants to put her soul into Jennifer Tilly, and Chucky wants to put his soul into Redman, and the plan is to impregnate Jennifer Tilly so she can give birth to a child for Glenn's soul to inhabit. Because voodoo pregnancy is accelerated. Yeah, this movie is insane. Somehow the movie manages to be even weirder than the previous entry, but I would at least give it points for being interesting. For one, it's very progressive in its approach to gender and sexuality. Their child occasionally goes by Glenn, other times they go by Glenda, which itself is a reference to the Ed Wood film that dealt with transvestism and transsexuality. That being said, the conclusion of the film kind of messes with this a little bit, but we'll get back to that in a minute. As I said, even though the film isn't great, there are great things about it. For example, I think it has one of the best kills ever. And for as ludicrous as this film can be, it really does manage to give Chucky some real development, seeing him as a husband and a father and having a sort of journey of self-acceptance and discovery, that he really is a horrible person and accepts his life as a doll. It's kind of weirdly endearing.
I'm one of the most notorious slashers in history, and I don't want to give that up. I am Chucky, the killer doll, and I dig it! I have everything I want. A beautiful wife. A multi-talented kid. This is who I am, Tiff. This is me.
As strange and sloppy as the film can be at times, it's definitely entertaining. Wait a sec.
That's the girl from Messed Up Steading. That's John Waters. And that's not Britney Spears. You came so close to having my 3 childhood crushes.
As I was saying, the film is still very entertaining. In fact, some of the people I just mentioned gave me some of my favourite moments in the film. John Waters has a line that I absolutely love.
Pete Peters, celebrities revealed. Jennifer, what did you see?
What, you want me to draw you a picture?
Would you? Somebody, give her a piece of paper.
And naturally, Chucky kills the fake Britney.
Yours, asshole! Tonight we got the brand new
What will Chucky's killer line be? Is it A, Hit me baby one more time. B. I'm a bigger fan of Xtina. C. It's Chucky bitch. Or D. Oops, I did it again.
Oops, I did it again.
One thing it definitely retains from Bride of Chucky is its love and awareness of other horror films.
Just because it's your birthday, that doesn't mean that you can relinquish all
Well, we know where this is going.
I can't think of a thing to say.
I'm sick.
Fuck it.
Let's talk about this ending, which has entirely too much going on. We mentioned earlier that Chucky now accepts himself as this murderous killer doll, but Tiffany doesn't accept him for that and rejects him and promises to keep Glenn from him. As a result, Chucky tries to kill Tiffany. Jennifer Tilly, meanwhile, is pregnant with twins, and Tiffany is trying to put her soul into Jennifer Tilly when Chucky seemingly kills her. As a result of this, Glenn challenges Chucky to a fight and ends up chopping him to pieces, presumably killing him. Cut to 5 years later, and we see that the soul transfer worked, and Tiffany now inhabits the body of Jennifer Tilly. Glenn or Glenda, meanwhile, apparently had two souls in them, and one is put into the male twin, Glenn, and another is put into the female twin, Glenda. One of Glenn's birthday presents turns out to be Chucky's arm, which attacks him, so yeah, no one died. Let's talk about this ending a little bit. So earlier I said the film was pretty progressive in that it had a non-binary character in the lead, which is still pretty good, but the ending also sort of implies that anyone who is split between genders has multiple personalities, which, yikes. At least you tried, I guess. It also feels like the beginning of something that would become a bigger problem for me with later entries, which is the amount of baggage this series is carrying with it. But we'll get to that when we talk about the next two films.
Seed of Chucky is insane. And it's certainly a bit less refined than Bride of Chucky, but it's still a very fun and original movie, if not a little bit sloppy and scattered. One really positive thing I can say about the Child's Play series is that each entry is very unique. They're all a little bit different. And this is definitely that. I enjoy the weird meta horror, and I think it's just so strange that it's enjoyable. It's funny, but it is a little bit off the wall. That being said, this would also be the end of the comedic Chucky films. The next two entries would send Chucky back to horror and straight to video. Come back for the next video where we're going to look at the straight to DVD final two entries of the main series, the remake, and the future of the Killer Doll.